The Grand Deliberation Chamber of the Galactic Council was one of the most impressive places in the known galaxy. It sat at the center of Orion Nexus Station, a massive space station that floated peacefully between three star systems. The chamber itself was enormous, big enough to hold thousands of beings at once. The walls curved upward like the inside of a shell, and the ceiling was made of transparent alloy, showing nothing but open space and distant stars above. Every seat was filled. Every screen was active. The air hummed with the quiet noise of hundreds of alien voices talking at once. Today was Fleet Census Day. It happened once every 20 years. Every species that was a member of the Galactic Council was required to declare their full military assets. Every warship, every battle station, every armed vessel. The rule was simple. You declared what you had, and the Council recorded it. It kept things honest. It kept the peace. No one was supposed to be hiding anything. Chief Arbiter Velthara of the Quindai called the session to order. She was tall, pale, and ancient by human standards, over 300 years old, with silver skin and 6 long fingers on each hand. She had run the fleet census 4 times before. She expected today to be like all the others. Boring, slow, and predictable. The Kreth Empire went first. Their ambassador, a massive reptile in golden armor, stood and declared 4,200 Dreadnought-class warships, along with thousands of smaller vessels. The chamber gave a polite acknowledgement. The Kreth had the largest fleet in the council. Everyone knew it. Everyone had known it for centuries. The Kreth ambassador sat back down with a satisfied look on his face. The Lucia collective followed. They declared no warships at all, as usual. Just monitoring drones and emergency response vessels. A few ambassadors quietly rolled their eyes. Everyone respected the Lucia, but no one really understood them. The Tharvan merchant guilds declared a modest fleet-armed trade escorts, they called them. The Quindai declared 1,100 warships. The Velmorak Confederacy declared 640. One by one, each species stood, declared their numbers, and sat down. The Council's AI system, a vast intelligence known simply as Oracle, recorded everything in real time and displayed it on the main screen for all to see. Everything was going smoothly. Then it was humanity's turn. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood up from the human delegations section. She was a short woman, brown-skinned, with dark hair pulled back tightly. She wore the standard diplomatic uniform of the Terran government, dark blue, simple, with a small Earth flag on the shoulder. She did not look nervous. She did not look proud. She looked like someone about to read out a shopping list. She placed a data chip on the submission terminal in front of her. "Human declaration submitted," she said, and sat back down. She picked up the small cup of coffee she had brought from the human delegation's lounge and took a slow sip. Oracle processed the file. For 2 full seconds, nothing happened. Then Oracle's calm, neutral voice spoke. "Submission error. Data appears to be corrupted. Please resubmit." Vasquez raised an eyebrow. She stood again. "It is not corrupted." She placed a second chip down a backup copy. Resubmitting. Oracle processed it again. Another 2 seconds of silence. Submission received. Verification in progress. The chamber waited. Ambassadors talked quietly among themselves. The Kreth ambassador leaned over to whisper something to his aide. No one was paying much attention to the human section. Humanity had only been in the council for 60 years. They were newcomers. They had a reasonable fleet, everyone assumed. Maybe a few hundred warships. Perhaps 1,000 at most. They were young after all. Then Oracle spoke again. Verification complete. The number appeared on the main screen. 51,2874. The chamber went quiet. Completely quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when every single person in a room stops breathing at the same time. Velthara stared at the screen. She blinked 3 times slowly, which for a Quindai was the equivalent of someone rubbing their eyes in disbelief. "Oracle," she said, her voice very calm and very careful. "Please clarify the unit of measurement for the human fleet declaration." Clarification provided. Oracle said, "The figure of 512,000 874 refers to Dreadnought-class vessels, capital warships of the highest military classification. The chamber exploded. It did not explode slowly or politely. It exploded all at once, like something had been set on fire. Ambassadors leapt to their feet. Voices shouted over each other in dozens of languages. The translation systems struggled to keep up with the noise. The Velmorak ambassador knocked over his water container. An elder member of the Lusha delegation made a sound that no one in the room had ever heard a Lusha make before, a high, thin, panicked whistle. The Kreth ambassador went a different shade of green. Velthara raised her hand and called for order 3 times before the room began to quiet down. Even then, the silence was shaky. Ambassadors kept looking at the number on the screen as if they expected it to change. "This figure will be verified manually," Velthara announced, her voice firm. "We will take a 30-minute recess." The manual verification team, a group of 12 senior council analysts from 6 different species, went to work immediately. They cross-checked the human submission against independent deep space sensor records, trade route logs, shipyard construction reports, and fuel consumption data from human space. They ran the numbers 4 times. They came back in 22 minutes. The number did not change. When Velthara returned to her seat and faced the chamber again, she looked like she had aged 10 years in half an hour. The main screen still showed the number. The chamber was deathly quiet again. But this time, the quiet had weight behind it, the kind that sits in your chest. Every eye in the room turned toward the human delegation. Elena Vasquez was finishing her coffee. She set the cup down, noticed the silence, and looked up at the chief arbiter with a calm, open expression, as if she were simply waiting to hear what came next. Velthara's voice came out slower and more careful than usual. "Ambassador Vasquez," she said, "perhaps you can help the council understand something." "Of course," Vasquez said. "Your civilization has been a member of this council for 60 years. Velthara paused. "You have been a spacefaring species for less than 4 centuries. In that time, in a span that most of our members would consider barely enough time to establish basic colony infrastructure, you have somehow constructed and registered over 500,000 capital class warships." She stopped again. The chamber was listening to every word. "How?" Vasquez looked at her for a moment. A small, quiet expression passed across her face. Not pride, exactly. Not amusement, either. Something more like the look of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has simply gotten used to the weight. "Well," she said, "it is a bit of a long story." Velthara leaned forward slightly. "We have time." And so Elena Vasquez, ambassador of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, set her empty coffee cup to the side, folded her hands on the table in front of her, and began to tell the Galactic Council exactly how humanity had built the largest war fleet in the known galaxy, not out of ambition, not out of hunger for power, but out of something far simpler, and far more human than that: fear, and the decision to never, ever be afraid in the same way twice. The year was 2291, and humanity was losing. No one in the Galactic Council had known about the Dreth War at the time. Humanity had not yet made contact with the Council. They were alone out there, a young species that had just pushed past the edge of their own solar system, excited and curious, and completely unprepared for what waited for them in the dark between stars. The Dreth Dominion found them first. The Dreth were old. They had been traveling the stars for over 2,000 years. They were tall, armored in thick natural plates of bone and muscle, with eyes that could see heat and minds that thought only in terms of territory and dominance. When they found humanity's early colony ships pushing into what the Dreth considered their expansion corridor, they did not send a greeting. They did not ask questions. They opened fire. The first battle lasted 11 minutes. Humanity lost all 43 ships in the convoy. There were no survivors. For the next 9 years, the Dreth Dominion and the human species were at war. It was brutal and one-sided for most of those years. Humanity fought back hard, they always did, but the Dreth had more ships, better weapons, and centuries of war experience. Human colonies were burned. Entire populations were forced to evacuate. Supply lines were cut. At one point in 2297, the Dreadnought fleet pushed close enough to the outer solar system that people on Earth could track the battle signals with amateur equipment. It was the most terrifying period in human history since the World Wars centuries before. In the end, humanity found a way to win. They always found a way. They adapted their tactics, built faster ships, developed better shields, and hit the Dreadnought at angles and speeds the older species had never planned for. In 2300, the Dreadnought Dominion signed a ceasefire. They did not sign it out of respect. They signed it because they had suddenly found fighting humans to be far more expensive than expected. The Dreadnought respected cost. Humanity had survived, but they had lost over 40,000 ships. Whole generations of young men and women who had never wanted to be soldiers were dead. Dozens of colonies had been destroyed. It had taken everything they had just to hold on. The leaders of every human nation, every major corporation, and every colony government met on Earth in the city of Geneva in the year 2301. The meeting lasted 3 weeks. A lot of things were discussed. A lot of blame was thrown around. A lot of grief was expressed. But when it was all over, only one decision came out of those 3 weeks, and it was agreed upon by every single party in the room without a single objection. Never again. Those were the 2 words that shaped the next 80 years of human civilization. Never again would humanity be caught small. Never again would they enter a conflict with too few ships, too little firepower, too little armor. The Dreadnought War had taught them that the galaxy was not a friendly place. It was not waiting to welcome them. It was dangerous, and patience did not protect you. Numbers did. The Solar Industrialization Mandate was signed in 2302. It was a simple document, but its effects were enormous. Every nation, every corporation, every colony with the resources to do so was given major incentives to build warships, tax breaks, government contracts, priority access to raw materials, construction licenses. The message was clear. Build, and build constantly, and do not stop. What happened next surprised even the people who wrote the mandate. Humanity built faster than anyone expected. Not because they were forced to, because they wanted to. It became a matter of pride. Nations competed with each other to see who could build the most. Corporations turned warship manufacturing into one of the most profitable industries in human space. Colonies built local fleets because they did not want to depend on Earth for protection. Some colonies were 3 or 4 weeks away from any reinforcement. They wanted their own ships. They built them. The key was the design. Human engineers had spent the years of the Dreadnought War learning exactly what a warship needed to do to survive. After the war, they threw out most of the old designs and started fresh. What they came up with was the Type 7 modular dreadnought frame, and it changed everything. The Type 7 was not the most powerful warship ever built. It was not the fastest or the most advanced. But it was something far more valuable than either of those things. It was simple. It could be built quickly, in pieces, using manufacturing systems that almost any colony with decent industry could operate. The parts were standardized. If a ship was damaged, it could be repaired with the same parts used in construction. It was a warship designed to be made in enormous numbers at a reasonable cost. The Jovian Forge Rings, a massive network of automated shipyards built in orbit around Jupiter, became the heart of this production. At their peak, the Forge Rings were completing 14 dreadnoughts every single day. The factories ran around the clock. The numbers grew, and they kept growing. By 2340, humanity had over 100,000 registered dreadnoughts. By 2360, that number had passed 250,000. By 2387, the year of the fleet census, it had passed 500,000. What made the Galactic Council's reaction especially interesting was that no one had tried to hide any of it. The ships were registered. The shipyards were listed in public trade records. Fuel purchases were documented. Human space was full of activity that any observant species could have noticed, if they had simply looked carefully enough. The Council had not looked. They had assumed. They had seen a young species, counted their short years in space, and decided they knew what that meant. They had been wrong. One of the stranger facts that came out during Vasquez's account was about the University of New Singapore. The university had purchased a Dreadnought frame in 2309 as a research and training vessel. It was named the UNAS Pythagoras. It was fully armed, fully crewed by a rotating team of student engineers and researchers, and was still in active service in 2387. It was officially the oldest continuously active capital warship in human space. The engineering faculty had maintained it with obsessive care for almost 80 years. They were very proud of it. The chamber listened to all of this in stunned silence. Some ambassadors had stopped blinking. The Kreth ambassador had not moved in several minutes. Velthara took careful notes with the expression of someone trying very hard not to show how unsettled they were. Far away, on the other side of the station, in a secure communications room, a Quendai intelligence analyst was finishing a decoded report that had taken her team 6 months to put together. It was supposed to explain why human military data never seemed to match what the Council expected. She had thought it was a translation issue, or a classification error. Now she understood. She typed her summary and sent it to the Council Intelligence Bureau. It was 1 sentence long. They were scared, so they built. And they never unlearned how. She stared at the message for a moment before sending it. Then she added one more line. There may be something in the deep regions of their patrol space that they have not told us about. I recommend we find out what it is before we decide anything else. She sent the report and sat back in her chair, looking out the small window at the stars. She had a feeling that the fleet census was the least interesting thing that was going to happen this week. The emergency session was called the very next morning. It was supposed to be an organized discussion. It was not organized. It was not really a discussion either. It was, for the first 2 hours, mostly shouting, which was impressive considering that several of the species present did not technically shout. The Lucia expressed distress through color changes and vibration. The Velmorak communicated anger through a deep clicking sound that their translator units converted into sharp, clipped sentences. But the result was the same. Everyone in the chamber was upset, and they were all upset in slightly different directions, which made everything worse. Chief Arbiter Velthara sat at the center of it all and let it run for a while. She had learned over 3 centuries that sometimes you had to let a room exhaust itself before it could think clearly. She sat with her long fingers pressed together and her silver eyes half closed, and she waited. On the other side of the chamber, Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat with 2 members of her delegation and a fresh cup of coffee. She was reading something on her personal screen. She looked up occasionally when the noise got particularly loud, then went back to reading. Eventually, the shouting slowed. Velthara raised her hand. "We will proceed in order," she said. "Each delegation will speak once, before responses are taken." The Kreth Empire went first. Their lead ambassador, Admiral Delegate Gorak, was a large, heavy being, with a face full of old scars and eyes like polished copper. He stood with the confidence of someone who had commanded actual battles, which he had. "The position of the Kreth Empire is clear," he said, his voice deep and flat. "A single species possessing 500,000 capital warships is not a military. It is a threat to the stability of every civilization in this council. We move for immediate sanctions. Humanity's shipyard construction must be halted. Their fleet must be reduced to a number consistent with their size and standing. We further propose that a joint council fleet be authorized to enforce these measures, if the humans refuse." He sat down. Several ambassadors nodded. Several others went very still. The Tharvan delegate, a small being wrapped in layers of pale cloth, leaned toward their aide and whispered something that the translation system caught as, "That would be an extremely expensive war. Run the numbers again." The Lucia collective spoke next, or rather, their 3 representatives spoke together in their usual synchronized way, their voices layering over each other like a cord. "We do not support sanctions through force," they said, "but we share the concern. A mind that builds this much is a mind that expects this much violence. We wish to understand the nature of that expectation before we form a position." The Velmorak Confederacy called for a special investigative committee. The minor members mostly agreed with whoever seemed safest to agree with. Then, the Tharvan Merchant Guild stood. Their delegate was named Oruset, and she was small, quick-eyed, and almost always smiling. She adjusted her cloth wrapping and looked around the room with an expression of patient amusement. The Tharvan guilds respectfully disagree with the proposed sanctions, she said. We have, in fact, already opened preliminary conversations with the Terran Trade Commission regarding component licensing agreements for the Type 7 Dreadnought frame. She paused, while the room made various noises of disbelief. The modular design is extraordinary. The manufacturing efficiency is unlike anything in recorded production history. We see opportunity, not threat. Gorek stared at her. You are negotiating weapons deals while we are trying to discuss a security crisis? We are negotiating industrial agreements, Oruset said pleasantly. While you are trying to pick a fight with the species that has more warships than all of us combined. We feel our approach is wiser. The room erupted again. Velthara let it run for 30 seconds, then brought it back under control. It was during this second wave of chaos that the real moment happened, the one that people would later say defined the session. Admiral Delegate Gorek stood again without waiting to be recognized. He turned and looked directly at Vasquez across the chamber. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. Ambassador Vasquez, I will ask you directly, because I am done with ceremony. What does humanity intend to do with 500,000 warships? The chamber went quiet. Every head turned. Vasquez looked up from her screen. She set it down slowly. She looked at Gorek with the same calm expression she had worn since the beginning, not cold, not aggressive, just settled, like someone standing on ground they knew very well. The same thing we do with every other tool we've ever built. Admiral, she said, use them when we must, store them when we don't, and sleep a little better at night knowing they exist. The silence stretched out for several seconds. Then Velthara spoke quietly. And what is it, Ambassador, that causes your species to require that kind of sleep? Vasquez looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not fear, not anger. More like the expression of someone looking at a memory they carry carefully. There is a region at the edge of our patrol space, she said. We call it the Veil. 3 civilizations disappeared there, before humanity reached the stars. We have been sending patrol fleets into that region for decades. We have not found answers yet. We do not intend to stop looking. She paused. And we do not intend to be unprepared when we do find something. Another silence. A different kind this time. Gorek sat down slowly. He did not speak again for the rest of the session. Later that evening, the council voted on the Kreth sanctions motion. It failed. Not by a small margin, it failed badly. Most members voted against it, but not because they trusted humanity. They voted against it because someone in the back offices of the Council Intelligence Bureau had quietly distributed Oruset's simple mathematical analysis of what a military conflict with humanity would actually look like. The document was 3 pages long and ended with a single line in bold. Do not do this. The sanctions motion was tabled indefinitely. What was approved instead was a formal observer mission to human space. One representative from the council would travel into the Terran sphere, observe what was there firsthand, and report back directly. The council needed real information, not assumptions. The being selected for this mission was a young Quendai intelligence officer named Kyle, 9. He was chosen because he was careful, honest, and most importantly, because his supervisor said he was the least likely of all available candidates to panic. That turned out to be only partially true. Vasquez was informed of the decision by Velthara after the session. She nodded once. We'll arrange full access, she said simply. You don't have concerns about a council observer in your space? Velthara asked. No, Vasquez said. She picked up her empty coffee cup and her personal screen. In fact, we've been wondering when someone would finally ask to look. She paused at the door. Kale, 9 should bring warm clothes. Some of the patrol sectors are cold. Then she walked out, and the door slid closed behind her, and Velthara sat alone in the empty session room for a long time, looking at the number that was still showing on the main display. 51,2874. She had been running the Galactic Council for longer than some species had been in space. She had seen crises, wars, collapses, and revivals. She had watched empires fade and new civilizations rise. She had never once, in all of that time, felt so certain that she was only seeing a small part of a much larger picture. She turned off the display and went to prepare the observer briefing documents. She included a note at the top, for Kale, 9. Ask the humans everything. Assume nothing. Kale, 9, had read every document the Council had on humanity before he boarded the Terran diplomatic transport. He had read them twice. He was thorough by nature, a quality that had served him well in intelligence work, and he believed that good preparation meant fewer surprises. He was wrong about that. Nothing could have prepared him. The first stop on his tour was the Dreth Memorial Corridor. His human escort, a quiet naval officer named Commander Sola Reyes, told him about it before they arrived. She described it simply a stretch of space where the wreckage of the Dreth War had been preserved. A monument. A reminder. Kale, 9, had nodded and made a note in his report file. He had expected something modest. A few broken hulls floating in a marked zone. Something like the memorial sites other species kept dignified, contained, symbolic. He stood at the observation window as the transport moved through the corridor and did not speak for a very long time. The wreckage stretched in every direction, as far as the sensors could read. 40,000 ships, or what remained of them. Some were barely recognizable as ships at all. Others were almost whole, hanging silently in the dark, their surfaces cold, and their interiors empty. The hulls had been preserved by a combination of low-temperature spray sealant and dedicated maintenance drones that still patrolled the area in slow, quiet loops. There were names on the ships. He could read some of them as they passed. Names in human languages: English, Mandarin, Hindi, Portuguese, Arabic. Names of places on Earth. Names of people. The corridor was 11 light minutes long. Kale, 9, did not write anything in his report file for a full hour after they passed through it. When he finally did, he wrote only this: I did not understand before. I am beginning to understand now. Commander Reyes did not try to explain or comfort him. She had been through the corridor many times. She understood that some things needed to be absorbed in silence. The second stop was the colony of Kepler's Rest. It was a mid-rim colony, population 3 million, sitting on a habitable moon, 6 weeks of travel from Earth, and 3 weeks from any major human military base. By the standards of the Galactic Council, it was a small and relatively young settlement. By any measure, it should have been vulnerable. It was not. Kepler's Rest maintained a local fleet of 200 dreadnoughts, all type, 7 frames, all funded and crewed by the colony itself. The shipyard that built and maintained them was the largest employer on the moon. The colony governor, a woman named Petra Andic, met Kale, 9, personally, and showed him around the facilities with visible pride. Why 200? Kale, 9, asked at one point. It was a genuine question. 200 dreadnoughts for 3 million people was a staggering ratio. Governor Andic looked at him as if the answer was obvious. We're 3 weeks from any help, she said. 3 weeks is a long time if something goes wrong. We decided a long time ago that we weren't going to wait 3 weeks. We decided to be our own help. Kale, 9, wrote that down word for word. He saw the same thing repeated across every colony he visited. Some had fewer ships, some had more. But all of them had made the same decision: they were not going to depend entirely on someone else to protect them. They were going to be ready. The mindset was not aggressive. It was not hostile. It was the same mindset as someone who lived in a dangerous neighborhood and learned to lock their doors, learned self-defense, kept emergency supplies in the basement. It was preparation. It was human. He visited the Jovian forge rings next, and that was when the scale of it truly hit him. He had read the production numbers in his briefing documents. 14 dreadnoughts per day. He had written it down. He had thought he understood it. He did not understand it until he stood in the observation deck of the main administration tower of Forge Ring 7 and watched 3 completed dreadnought frames, each one over a kilometer-long roll, out of their assembly. Bays simultaneously, guided by automated tug drones toward the fitting stations where weapons, engines, and crew systems would be installed. It was quiet. It was organized. It was completely routine. Workers ate lunch in the cafeteria down the hall. A maintenance crew played cards in a break room. A supervisor walked past Kale, Nine's observation window with a clipboard and a slightly bored expression, checking off items on a list without looking up. 14 per day. Every day. For decades. Kale, 9, pressed his hand flat against the window and watched another frame begin its slow journey out of the bay. He felt something he had no word for in his own language. A feeling he later described in his report as the sensation of standing next to something vast that does not know it is vast. The exercise came last. He had been told about it in advance. A standard deep space naval drill, they called it. 10,000 ships, coordinated movement, long-range weapons testing. He was told it would take approximately 4 hours. He was given a seat in the observation suite of a Terran Fleet Command vessel. A large ship, fast and well-armed. But nothing compared to what was outside its windows. 10,000 dreadnoughts moved in formation. They moved with a precision that seemed impossible for machines that large. The patterns shifted and reformed in ways that his mind struggled to follow, not because they were complicated, but because the numbers involved were simply too large for his instincts to process naturally. He had grown up around fleets of hundreds, maybe thousands. The idea of 10,000 ships moving as one was something his brain kept trying to reduce to a smaller, more manageable image, and failing. Halfway through the exercise, he had to be helped to a medical bay. His body had gone into a mild stress response. He was given a calming injection and a glass of water, and, eventually, a cup of a warm human drink called tea. The officer who brought it to him, a young ensign who looked barely old enough to serve, patted him gently on the shoulder. "It gets easier to look at," she said kindly. "The first time is always the worst." He thanked her and drank the tea and went back to his window. When the exercise was over, he asked Commander Reyes to take him to the edge of human patrol space. She hesitated slightly before agreeing. The veil was not a physical thing. It was a designation, a region of deep space that sensors penetrated poorly, that communication signals passed through strangely, and that 3 different alien civilizations had disappeared into long before humanity had reached the stars. The Quendai records on those disappearances were old and incomplete. Most of the Council had quietly stopped thinking about them. Humanity had not stopped thinking about them. Standing at the edge of it, looking out at the region on the long-range display, watching the pattern of human patrol ships that moved through it in slow, steady rotations, watching the deep-range probes that drifted further and further in without ever returning, Kale, 9, finally understood, completely. The fleet was not about dominance. It was not about conquest. It was not even really about the Dreth, not anymore. The Dreth War had lit the spark, but this was what fed the fire. This dark, silent region at the edge of everything. This question mark the size of several star systems. Humanity did not know what was in the veil, but they had decided quietly, practically, with characteristic human thoroughness, that when they found out, they were going to be ready. KL, 9, returned to Orion Nexus Station 11 days later. He sat down and wrote his report. It was 600 pages long. He included his personal notes, his records of every conversation, every observation, every figure and fact and image he had collected. He included the photo he had taken from the observation window of Forge Ring 7, with 3 dreadnoughts rolling into the dark in formation. He included the coordinates of the Dreth Memorial Corridor. He included the words of Governor Andic, word for word. The summary was 3 words. Do not antagonize. He sat back and looked at those 3 words for a long time. Then he added one more paragraph, not as a formal finding, but as a personal note to Velthara, who he knew would read the full report herself. They are not building an empire, he wrote. They are building a wall. I do not know yet what they expect to be on the other side of it. But I believe, and I say this having looked at their faces, having walked through their memorial, having stood at the edge of the veil, that they know something, or suspect something, that the rest of the Council has not yet taken seriously. I recommend we ask them directly, and I recommend we listen carefully to the answer. He submitted the report and went to find something warm to eat. He had been cold since the veil. The final session of the Council's emergency review was scheduled for the 3rd morning after Kale, 9's report was distributed. Most members had read the full report. Those who hadn't had read the summary, and the summary was enough. The chamber that assembled on that morning was quieter than any session Velthera could remember. There was no shouting. There was very little side conversation. Ambassadors sat in their places and looked at the floor, or at their screens, or at nothing in particular, with the expression of people who had been given a lot to think about and were still in the middle of thinking it. Kale, 9, sat in the observer gallery above the main floor. He looked tired. He had not slept well since returning from human space. He watched the proceedings from his seat, with his hands folded, and his face still. The human delegation sat in their usual section. Vasquez was there, as always, steady and calm. She had read Kyle, 9's report. She had not commented on it publicly. When a junior member of the Quendai delegation had quietly thanked her for allowing the observer mission, she had simply nodded and said that it was overdue. Velthera called the session to order. The Council will now vote on the formal status of the Terran Fleet Declaration and any measures to be taken in response. She looked around the chamber. The motion from the Kreth Empire calling for imposed fleet reduction and construction sanctions is still on the table. We will vote on that first. Admiral Delegate Gorak sat in his seat and did not move. He had been quiet since KL, 9's report. Something in it had settled on him, not softened him, exactly, but shifted something. He was a military mind. He understood preparation. He understood what it meant to build with a specific threat in mind. He did not like what he understood, but he understood it. When the vote was called, the result came quickly. The Kreth sanctions motion failed, 31 votes against, 9 in favor, 7 abstentions. No one cheered. No one seemed particularly relieved either. The vote felt less like a victory and more like a doorway that had been walked through the beginning of something, not the end. The next motion was simpler: full recognition of humanity's fleet declaration as a legal and registered military asset, with no punitive response. It passed with 38 votes. Then the Lusha Collective requested the floor. The 3 representatives stood together as they always did, their voices layering in that soft, harmonic way. The chamber listened closely. The Lusha did not often make formal declarations outside their routine votes. "We have spent a great deal of time in this session being afraid of humanity," they said. "We have spent very little time asking whether humanity is afraid of something else." A pause. "We read the observer's report. We considered it carefully. We wish to say, for the record, that we sense no malice in the human delegation. What we sense is memory and readiness. We vote with humanity." Vasquez looked up from her screen when the Lusha spoke. She looked at their 3 representatives for a moment. Something passed across her face, quiet and genuine. Not a diplomatic expression, but a real one. She gave a small nod. The Lusha representative in the center nodded back. Velthara was about to move to the final item on the agenda, a formal framework for future military transparency between the Council and the Terran government, when the alert sounded. It was not a soft alert. It was the kind that cut through everything, the deep, 2-tone signal that the Council's communication systems reserved for Priority 1 emergency transmissions. Every screen in the chamber switched automatically to the incoming signal header. The source was human. Patrol Fleet 17, operating in the Vale region. The text of the transmission appeared on the main display. Priority 1. Contact established. Entity unclassified. Scale: extreme. Nature: hostile. All available forces requested. This is not a drill. The chamber did not explode this time. It froze. Completely. Totally. Utterly froze. Then the tactical display that the Council shared with Terran Space, a live feed of registered fleet positions, began to change. The changes were fast. The dots on the display that represented human ships began to move. Not 1 or 2. Not a local patrol response. Dozens at first, then hundreds, then thousands of signals, shifting position, rerouting, converging on the coordinates attached to Patrol Fleet 17's transmission. The movement was quiet and enormous, and completely without hesitation, like a tide that had always been going this direction and had simply been waiting for the moment to show it. Someone in the chamber counted out loud, involuntarily, just reading the numbers as they climbed on the display. 10,000 ships moving, 20,000, 40,000, 80,000 dreadnoughts, all heading toward the Veil, and the number was still climbing. No orders were being shouted. No emergency councils were being called in human space. The response was already happening, exactly as it had been planned for, because of course it had been planned for. Of course they had a protocol. Of course the ships were already assigned and the crews already briefed and the coordinates already preloaded. Because this was humanity. Because they had spent 80 years making sure that when this moment came, they would not be slow. Gorik watched the display in silence. He was a military officer of 40 years' experience, and he recognized what he was seeing. He recognized it not as aggression, but as readiness pure, total, breathtaking readiness. The kind that could only come from long and serious preparation. He thought about the Dreath Memorial Corridor, 11 light minutes of preserved wreckage, and he finally, completely understood. They had built all of this so that the corridor never grew longer. Vasquez was already on her feet. She was speaking quietly into a personal communicator, receiving updates from the Terran Defense Command. Her face was composed. She was working. Then she lowered the communicator and turned to face the chamber. Every eye was on her. The entity our patrol fleet has encountered does not match any known species in council records or human records, she said. Her voice was steady, not afraid, focused. It is large. It is hostile. We are responding. She paused. The council is welcome to send observers. We will ensure their safety. Another pause. The briefest one. This is what we built for. She turned back to her communicator. No one in the chamber spoke for a long moment. Then Velthara, slowly and carefully, began to draft an emergency communication to every council member government. In it, she recommended full cooperation with humanity for the duration of the contact event, offered whatever council resources were available, and attached Kale, Nine's full report for any members who had not yet read it. In the observer gallery, Kale, 9, watched the tactical display. The numbers were still climbing. The movement was still quiet, still organized, still without visible panic. Just ships, an uncountable river of ships flowing toward the dark. He thought about the forge rings. 14 per day, every day, for decades. He thought about Kepler's rest, and Governor Andic. We decided to be our own help. He thought about the young ensign with the cup of tea, and the workers eating lunch while dreadnoughts rolled out behind them, and the maintenance drones patrolling the memorial in slow, quiet loops, making sure the names on the ships stayed readable. He thought about what it meant to be a species that built a wall before it knew for certain that something was coming, and then found out it was right. He opened his report file and added one final line. Humanity did not build a military. They built an answer to every question the universe had ever dared to ask them with violence. And somewhere, in the dark beyond the veil, something ancient and terrible was about to learn that the humans had been waiting, patiently and industriously, for a very long time. He closed the file. Outside, through the station's observation windows, the stars were the same as they had always been, cold and distant and indifferent. But in the space between them, something was moving. 500,000 strong and still growing, still building, still ready. Humanity was going to answer the door. They had been preparing for this knock for 80 years. They were not afraid.